Joseph McDonnell, Professor of Public Policy and Management at the Muskie School of Public Service at University of Southern Maine. He's observed and visited China many times over the past 20 years. In 2013, he secured a Confucius Institute for USM and served as its director until 2018. McDonnell has authored articles on China for the Portland Press Herald and the Bangor Daily News. He came to Maine in 2011 to serve as dean of the professional schools at USM. Prior to that, he served as dean of the business school at Stony Brook University in New York. Please welcome Joseph McDonnell.
Thank you very much, Vee. I appreciate the invite tonight. It's great to be with you. So when I gave a talk similar to this a few months ago, I spoke about the pivot that the US was making towards China. And we saw the exit from Afghanistan that the US made was part of that, getting out of the Middle East so that it could concentrate on China. And then we saw the alliance with what is called the Quad, which was the US, Australia, India, and Japan, working together really to counter China. And now, several months later, we see that the pivot is back to Europe with the Russian buildup around Ukraine. So there was a pivot and then another pivot. And I think that the relationship between the US and Europe and China and the relationship between the US, Europe, and Russia have some analogies, have some connections to them. Of course, we have the authoritarian countries of Russia and China and the democratic countries in Europe and the US, but the alignment is not as tight as we may hope, both in our dealings with Russia and in our dealings with China. Of course, as we see in Russia, the relationship that Europe has with Russia is not the same as ours. I mean, we're on the other side of the world. They are in Russia's backyard. And the dependence that Europe has on Russia for its gas and oil, 40% of its gas comes from Russia, 30% of its oil. And so there is a different relationship than we have. And when you look at the relationship between the US and China, you have the two most largest economies in the world, both building up their military, both very much interested in East Asia, China wanting to have it all to itself as the largest power, the US wanting to make sure that does not happen. So we have military interests in that part of the world. Europe has a different relationship there, and it's and they do not necessarily want to get caught between these two big giants. And so both China and the US are trying to win Europe over to its side. I mean, the interesting thing that you see in both the European relationship to Russia and the relationship to China is that we have a kind of interdependence now, and the US and China have an interdependence. And so this interdependence, we hope, would stop aggression by any country to the other country, because we're so connected in a way that we weren't, say, during the before the Berlin Wall, before when the Soviets and the U.S. were in conflict. We had no interdependence. Now it's a highly interdependent world, and the question I think that's interesting to ask is whether this interdependency allows for aggression or prevents aggression. Now we will see with Ukraine, we may see with Taiwan as well. As does it allow Russia to do, I don't know about a whole invasion, but to go into Ukraine? Will Europe stay with us, and will we be united? It's an open question because of Europe's dependence there. And the same question can be asked about Taiwan. Not a perfect analogy, but there is high interdependence with the US and China and Europe and China. And so there is that question of, will we rupture that entire relationship if China chooses to be an aggressor? Let me back up a little bit to try to understand these relationships, particularly the Europe-China-US relationship. And we have to go back to the actions that former President Trump took with respect to China and with respect to Europe. So, because it is in those relationships that that I could say that we changed our relationships. We've strained the relationships with both Europe and China. The America First policy had a number of dimensions to it. First, it saw China as a threat. It saw its rise economically, its rise militarily, its rise technologically, and it said, we're going to slow this rise down. We're going to do what we can to prevent this country from becoming a rival of the US. The second thing it did was it looked not favorably upon globalization, and it looked upon globalization as a favor to China, and particularly the manufacturing industries and the jobs that went abroad, not all of them to China, but many of them to China. And so it wanted to halt the movement of globalization. And the third thing that it did was it wanted to end alliances. It dropped out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or didn't move forward with Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was an alliance that Obama had formed to get countries to band together to deal with China, exclude China, but work together, many of the countries in Asia. And then it challenged the transatlantic alliance, threatening to move out of NATO. And that, of course, changed the relationship from the post-World War II relationship between Europe and the US. And so Trump had labeled Europe at one point an adversary and imposed tariffs on them. The Biden administration has sought to repair that transatlantic relationship. But things have not gone particularly well. In Afghanistan, the Europeans felt that we moved unilaterally and did not listen to their interests in terms of how we would withdraw from Afghanistan. And then the relationship that we built between Britain and Australia and the US to build nuclear submarines. We saw that ended a relationship that Australia had with France to build conventional submarines, and France withdrew its diplomats from the US for a while, which was a pretty harsh move. And so we've been a bit behind the curve in redeveloping the relationship with Europe. And now, of course, we're seeing whether we can build it with respect to Russia's possible movement into Ukraine. The EU is not one country. It's made up of 30 different countries. They all have their own agendas and different relationships. And we've just seen how each of them is reacting a little differently to the possibility of a Russian incursion into Ukraine. And then the big question in the relationship between the US and Europe is whether a Trump will return in 24 or somebody like Trump will return in 24. And so is Biden's efforts just a short-term patching together of the relationship. But once the trust is lost, it's much harder to build it back. In terms of our relationship with China, the Biden administration has maintained somewhat a similar relationship with China to the Trump administration, without the rhetoric, the bombast, but it still has been more on the adversarial than it would be on the partnership side. Biden has kept the tariffs that Trump had put in place, even though those tariffs are really mostly a tax on US businesses and customers. But it is bipartisan opposition to China, I think, has prevented Biden, even if he wanted to move in a different direction with China with respect to the tariffs. And the tariffs, by the way, did not accomplish what might have been hoped in terms of the change in behavior from China. So, and at this point, even the Trump agreement, China has only met 60% of its goals for importing more product from the US. So the net effect of those tariffs has really not been helpful in, from our point of view, from the America's point of view, nor has it changed China's behavior, which it had hoped. So the US, as we look at what is happening and we see a more adversarial relationship, but we really have to keep in mind that our relationship to China is very complex, and you can think of it in three ways. One, we're an adversary, and we are adversarial in terms of what's happening in the South China Sea, and certainly if there was any incursion into Taiwan. But we are also competitors in various business opportunities, and we are partners. So we have these three different relationships, and we should keep in mind that last year, the trade relationship with China, right now the numbers are only available through the end of November, but we're going to have trade of over $600 billion with China last year, which is higher than it was in the year before. And the amount of investment that is taking place in Chinese companies on the US stock exchanges is somewhere around $2 trillion. So this is hardly what you would consider a Cold War that we might be entering into with China, with that kind of trade, with that kind of interdependency and that kind of investment and ownership into China. So, on the one hand, we read the headlines in the paper, and on the other hand, you have to look at other things that are going on. Just shows you the complexity of the relationship. In terms of how China views the U.S., I think it's important to look at it in this way. They look at the U.S. as, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the U.S. had total dominance in the world, and then comes 9/11, the Iraq and the Afghanistan wars, Trump and America First, racial unrest, immigration disputes, extreme weather in the South and the fires in the West, a failure to deal with COVID-19, political polarization, the 2020 election, which is disputed, an insurrection. They look at the US as in decline. And they view China as rising. So they see this East as rising and the West as in decline. And there's some evidence for this. If you look at what China has done over the last 40 years, 1980, just think about it. For many of us, 1980 is not that far back. This was a dirt poor, backward, isolated country with, everybody lived in total poverty. And right now, you can look into the future and you can say that in the not too distant future, this will be the largest economy in the world. With 4 times the population of the US, it will likely have twice the size of the economy in time. So this is extraordinary. To understand China and to understand the Chinese mentality, it's very important to recognize what they call the century of humiliation. The century of humiliation is when they felt as if they were superior to the entire world, as a superior culture. This is in the 19th century. And then the first Opium War in 1839 took place, where initially the British wanted to trade with China, wanted the goods from China, the silk, the tea, and other things. And China had no interest in anything that the West could offer. What would the West give to us? So the West started to give opium, and the West had superior technology, and it conquered China, and that's when China lost Hong Kong. And over this century, other countries, the US included, took advantage of China. Japan came in later and took Taiwan. And Russia took some of China as well. And so for a century, China was under the subjugation of others. They were and it was with Mao's rise in 1949 that you had the first revolution, and China became its own republic as a communist country. And then fast forwarding to 1980, you have the second revolution with Deng Xiaoping, who decides to open up to become a market economy, an experimental economy. And this is the start of the China becoming the workshop of the world, the manufacturer of the world, using its massive labor to become the world's producer, manufacturer. And now Xi Jinping sees himself as the third revolution. And what he is seeking to do is to move forward with an aggressive nationalism and to move China from being just the producer of goods to making the technology of the future. And this is a program called, Made in China 2025. And the goal there was to become the leader in 10 different advanced technology areas: IT, robotics, aerospace, shipping, rails, energy, medicine, synthetic biology, materials. They're looking at the future. They want to be the top in all of these areas. Well, this, of course, creates a challenge for the US. It was one thing for them to manufacture cheaply for us. It's quite another thing to be a competitor in the areas of the future. But China's goal is to be self-sufficient so that it is not dependent on the other parts of the world. And what it is seeking to do is militarily, it's of course increasing its military budget, not anywhere near the US, but strong enough that it could maintain a stronghold in East Asia. And it has begun a program called Belt and Road, which it seeks to have relationships with countries surrounding it in Central Asia, Southern Asia, Africa, even Central Europe, and where it is investing in these countries. Now it's gone to the Middle East, that the US is exiting there, and it's developing relationships for trade in those areas. So, I mean, this is a country that is on the move and has been on the move. And as someone said, it has moved so fast, we have not had time to be astonished, but we should be astonished. It really is an amazing achievement over a 40-year period, which is not even our lifetimes. But let me shift a bit and talk about the headwinds that China faces, because it is not all positive. First, its economy is slowing. That's not to say that it is in recession, but it is slowing because of a number of reasons. I mean, COVID, even though it has been extraordinarily successful in tamping down COVID with its zero tolerance policy, that has been very costly to it. When it sees a case, it quarantines people, closes businesses, closes entire cities, and that has been costly. And of course, travel or tourism and business generally has slowed to what it was prior. Now, of course, prior it was growing at a very fast rate. So when it slows, it's still growing at a pretty healthy rate. But we have to remember that China is a middle income country, and that in order for it to become a developed country, it has to grow much faster. And so by a middle income country, its average income is about $12,000, which is significantly lower than Japan, Europe, South Korea, or certainly the US. And then the question is, can it really advance further? So that's a big question. The second issue is the preference that Xi Jinping has for state-owned companies versus the private companies. And we've seen this last year how it tamped down on some of the technology companies. It's opposed to all of the wealth that the billionaires and these technology companies have had. And like the US, it became concerned that these technology companies were becoming more powerful than the government. And I mean, we are also concerned that these technology companies are more powerful than anyone else. But they were going to do something about it, because control is a key feature of the Communist Party. So they really stepped in and said, we want to control. And the other thing that they wanted to do, like the progressive movement in the US, is they want to deal with income inequality. And but this is controversial, because the private companies represent more than 60% of the output in the country, and in the urban areas represents 80% of the employees. And the public companies, the state-owned companies, are nowhere near as effective or as productive as these other companies. So, so this is controversial that Xi Jinping is doing, and this could backfire on him. The third issue on headwinds is debt. China has a lot of debt. It's it's like a growing business that you say, I have so much faith in the growth that this is going to have. I don't mind going into deep debt, because I think we're going to grow faster than if we incur great debt. But it has 60% more debt than the average country, and its debt load is very, very high. And certainly, if there is a hiccup in its economy, this could cause real problems. And related to that is real estate. Real estate represents about 25 to 30% of its economy, and it has been slowing. And there are many of these development companies. I don't know if you've heard of Evergrande, but it has $300 billion in debt, and it has not been able to complete projects. And the state is trying to manage this without bailing them out, but it's created a huge problem for them. The other headwind is demographics. So in the 1980s, as the population was exploding, they decided to go towards a one-child policy. And now they are seeing that that has had negative implications about the future. Right now, the ratio of workers to retirees is 8-1. But as you look into the future over the next 30 years, that ratio is going to shrink to 2-1. And so they ended the one-child policy. They said you could have 2 children, then you could have 3, as many as you want. But young people are not, they're not having children. It's the same issue that in some sense we have, but we have immigration that kind of makes up for that. But they have not been able to figure out a way to grow their population. And so as the relationships with the West strain, there is the fear that what has been a great part of its economy to export products to places like Europe and the US, if that ends, that would become a real headwind for them. It would become a headwind for us too, so we shouldn't kid ourselves. But that's a concern that they have, and they felt that during the 2009 recession when we stopped buying, and at that point they said, we have to become more of a consumer society. We're large enough, as from China's point of view, they're large enough that they could become a consumer society like the US, which would make them less dependent on their exports. But of course, in order to be a consumer society, you have to people have to make enough money that they want to consume, and they have to feel as if they've got healthcare and they've got retirement and lots of things that people in China do not have. I mean, I'll just say for COVID-19, when we closed down the economy, we shipped money out, trillions of dollars out to people. China has not done that. So if China comes along and says, we're going to close your community and close down your business for a month or so, you better have some savings so that you can live. Well, if that's the climate that you're living in, you're hardly going to be a consumer society that is willing to purchase in excess or buy services in excess. So that's a problem. The other problem is the environment. I mean, I'm sure that if you look at Beijing during the Olympics, you will see a pristine city, but that's because all the factories are shut down at this point. But when the factories are going, pollution is going also. I mean, when you become the workshop of the world, your society looks more like Pittsburgh in 1940s than it does the U.S. Pittsburgh today. So how do you improve the environment without slowing the economy? And that's something that China has a commitment to its environment. It's actually pretty aggressive when you look at the kinds of things that they have done with wind and solar. I mean, that's remarkable. But nonetheless, right now, 60% of the electricity is produced by coal. They've been still building coal plants, and so it's a problem. And my final thing on that we should understand is, I think a big headwind is world public opinion. I mean, COVID-19, China. I mean, it originated in China. I mean, it's one of the great ironies of our time that it originates in China and has its greatest effect in the U.S., but it really, in a significant way, it was able to control COVID the way that we certainly weren't, that it could return its economy quicker. It's probably one of the few economies that grew last year. But the effect on the world was horrendous, and the world has blamed China for that. And its public opinion about China has declined precipitously. And then you add to that the takeover in Hong Kong, the aggressive position towards Taiwan, the human rights violations with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and you can see that opinion has just turned against China. Last year, U.S. public opinion, unfavorable public opinion, 76%. Germany, 71%. Japan, 88%. South Korea, 77%. Australia, 78%. Canada, 73%. I mean, those are numbers that show that you don't have a lot of friends, and the friends that you do have are based on a commercial relationship, and rather than any sympathy towards you. So let me just turn to Europe a bit, and the Europe-China relationship. I mean, China is Europe's largest trading partner, larger than the U.S. So we should keep that in mind. And Europe has not wanted to be forced by the U.S. to choose, to say, we want you to choose either us or them. They have not wanted that because, you know, they buy their products, they sell their products to Germany particularly is selling all their cars there. So that's a relationship that flourished. The China-Europe relationship flourished when Trump moved forward with his attitude towards Europe, and China hedged its bets and said, we're going to have a strong relationship with China. And so what China wanted to do was, before the Biden administration came in, it wanted to create a strong relationship with Europe. And so they entered into what was called a comprehensive agreement of investment. And it was subject to the approval of the EU Parliament. It took 7 years, 35 sessions to negotiate. But when Biden was coming in, China really gave Europe everything that they wanted. And so they got a very good deal with China. At the same time, Europe adopted a similar view towards China that we have. Maybe they made it a little bit more obvious, but they said, China is a partner, it's a competitor, and it's what they call the systemic rival, which could be called an adversary. And they wanted to operate with blinders on in these three lanes and not have the mix. So when China's relationship with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang heated up, Europe took action against the officials in Xinjiang and censured them. And China wanted a relationship that said, you do not interfere in our internal affairs, we won't interfere in your internal affairs. And China turned around and it took action with the European Union officials. And so there's been a standstill on this. The European Parliament did not move forward on that deal, even though it was a very, very good deal for Europe. And subsequently, Europe has said that it will engage with India and Japan, and particularly with Taiwan, which of course is a finger in the eye of China. And so it looks like that deal will not move forward. I mean, they still have relationships, but not with that deal. Let me just conclude with a few points at the end. Just the interdependency. I mean, the world is interdependent. We are interdependent with China. Europe is interdependent with China. And the question I think we should ask ourselves, is this interdependency going to keep us from war, or will it allow China to be an aggressor and to do things, and we won't do anything? We won't. I mean, do we really care about Taiwan when we have so many other relationships with China? That's a question for the U.S. to look into the mirror and say, you know, what is? Are we just a matter of looking at our economic interests, or are there democratic values that we stand for, and that these are more important than simply economic relationships? That's a question. I mean, that's a question that Europe's going to have to answer about Russia if it moves into Ukraine as well. And so the other thing that we see, I mean, when Kissinger and Nixon went to China in the 70s, they were trying to peel China away from Russia. We now see that China and Russia have been, you know, put back together. And the question that we have to ask is, you know, can we put back our relationship with Europe and the other Western democratic and even Eastern democrats, the South Koreas, the Japans, the Australias, to really create a strong bond there. The other thing that I think is important is to think about China's rise in its technology companies. It's investing in those companies. And then the question for us, we think that that's an unfair, they're putting their thumb on the scale by letting the government invest in those companies to make them successful so that it's not competitive. And then we have to say, will we do the same? And we see a bill going through now on semiconductors to invest in semiconductors. And of course, one of our major suppliers of semiconductors is in Taiwan. And so there's even more importance that we gain independence there. And finally, I would say that even though the focus has been on the adversarial relationship that we have with China, we have to remember the partnership end of it. I mean, we need China to deal with climate. We need China to deal with migration, to deal with pandemics, to deal with supply chain issues, to deal with cybersecurity, to deal with North Korea. there's so many areas where we really need to work together that we do need a balanced relationship, partnership, competitor, and adversary, and be able to operate in that complexity and not reduce it simply to an adversarial relationship. Although there's a lot of, when you think that 70 some odd percent of the American public is opposed to China or unfavorable to China, it's very easy to see how politicians on both sides of the aisle will just get, more negative and more negative, which just increases the hostility. And of course, increasing the hostility, we see that come back as well. And that's not going to be helpful. Every time we increase the hostility, China is reminded of that century of humility, and they're not going to allow that to happen. So we have to work together. So let me stop there and see what you have to say, and maybe we could have a dialogue about this.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was an excellent and broad discussion. We now have time for questions, and since we're all able to see one another, really you could just raise your hand. If you don't want to speak up, you can enter your question in the chat and we can find it that way. There's a good number of us that have showed up, so if you have more than one question, if you could please let folks take turns and make sure that we all get a chance to take part. And V, I believe that you'll step forward and facilitate the question and discussion if we need a facilitator.
You're on mute, V. Unmute.
All right, now you can hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Joe. That really is a very interesting, broad-ranging talk. And just to get things started, I was wondering, since Ukraine is in the news so much right now, what do you think is China's policy towards the massing of Russian troops on their border with Ukraine? And I think there's some indications that China's being somewhat supportive of Russia in the UN in any case. And does it appear to you that China and Russia might be pushed closer together during this crisis, and what might the consequences of that be?
Yeah, I think China is very glad to see the US having to pivot away from China and back to Europe and Russia. So it's a gift to China, and I mean, Putin and Xi Jinping will be together in the Olympics, and of course from Russia's side, it's if the U.S. Imposes sanctions, will China soften that to make it take our power away, since we have indicated that we're not going to enter into Ukraine to fight? We've said that we will issue sanctions, but sanctions are great if they really hurt Russia, but if China is able to soften that blow for Russia, it might give Putin a little bit more push to move forward. I mean, so I think it's a great thing for China. I mean, it's helpful for China that what Russia is doing.
Does anyone else want to raise their hand, or should we turn to the chat? I see that there was one comment in the chat about China seeming to want to sort of expand its sphere of influence into the rest of East Asia, and maybe to the exclusion of others. Do you think that's a reality, Joe, or is China very cautious in that avenue?
Well, there's no question that it would. I mean, it has been. I mean, it considers Taiwan part of China. You know, this is the one China policy that the whole world dances around, to say that, of course, it's all part of China, but it is and it isn't. And they've been building small islands to go down in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. It certainly wants to own all of that. And the US and others, Japan, Australia, Philippines, do not want that to happen. So yeah, that's China's interest, but at the same time, I don't think it wants a war. So it's this is the adversarial part of the relationship that I think we're just going to have to deal with. But I don't think right now they're going to do anything like going into Taiwan. But one could, if you're China, you might want to look at what the U.S. is going to do in Ukraine and see how that works out, because there's a bit of a analogy. Although I do think we have more interest in Asia to keep that line open, that sea open, than we might in Ukraine. But nonetheless, there's somewhat an analogy there. And between Russia and China and Iran, there's three countries that can kind of work together to keep us very busy and not focused on either of them. It's a lot for the U.S. to contend with.
Drew. Another comment from the chat was about the peasants in China, and is there still a great deal of inequality between the urban dwellers and the rural people in China, as there is a lot of places in the world?
Yes, there is. I mean, give China credit. They've taken 800 million people out of poverty. So the country has come a long way, and there's interest in helping the people. But there's definitely inequality from the city to the rural part of China, and even in the city, the prices of the homes are out of reach. It's kind of it's the same issue that my students have when they say they want to live in Portland.
Sure.
It's not that not that easy, because the prices have gotten very high. I think China has the same thing, even more so. So, but I mean, that's one of the things that Xi Jinping has dedicated himself to, and that, of course, is creating some controversy, that he might be dropping the some elements of the economy in order to create less inequality. So we'll see. I mean, it's a challenge for us. It's a challenge for China too.
Well, are there any more questions from the floor? I can't see a lot of people, so I can't see if anybody's raising a hand, but are there some new things in the chat?
Oh.
Oh, good. Here's a question. Could you comment on two issues? China's use of loans for infrastructure in developing countries and China's use of global surveillance of their population and reward restrictions based on people's behavior.
Yeah. So the first one on the Belt and Road Initiative, where China has invested in other countries, maybe built a port, maybe an airport, maybe a rail line, helping these countries. Sometimes the interest on that has been onerous for the developing country to pay. And so there's been some backlash to that from these countries towards China. And often China has brought in its own people to build rather than using native people to build. So it's been a mixed bag. On the other hand, they have done, they've really moved into Africa in a way that has tried to help. I think that they will be moving into the Middle East in a way. They're starting to do that. They want their oil, and in return, they will help them in countries in the Middle East develop, and especially places where you would say you don't want, don't interfere with our internal affairs. They're pretty ugly. You don't interfere with ours. So that's that's going on, and I would say with mixed results. In terms of surveillance, this technology that you can use to surveil people, China has used it, and it's a bit of a frightening situation where you say, somebody can, you can't go anywhere without people knowing. But it has certainly helped them when they want to contact trace for COVID. They're able to find out exactly where you have been and who has also been there, and they get out and they find everybody. But generally, it's it's a technology that gives people in power more control, and I can only hope that we don't use it here. But that's not something that prevents them from doing it. One of the things that they want to do is they want to control the society, and they also use control to reward and punish people, so they know what you're doing, and if you're doing the right thing according to the society, you'll get rewards. But if you do things that are going against the society, then you'll get punished. I guess that happens a little bit here, but not quite as direct as it happens there.
Right. Well, thank you. Miles, are there more questions in the chat, or is that about it?
I believe that is it. Does anybody want to speak up before we do end this evening? No. Those are
one
great
more,
questions.
one more
Oh,
point. I would say one more point that I would like to make is that, with the hostility towards China, we have ended a lot of relationships between universities, US universities in China. We have kept students out of the country because we don't want relations with China. This is a huge mistake. I mean, when students or faculty members come here, we get to, this is subversive. We get to show them what a democratic society is like. And people go back to China with a better attitude towards the US. I don't understand this notion of keeping people out. We should bring as many as possible because we want to show them what a democratic society is like. So, the hostility has a underbelly to it, which we have to be careful about.
the fear of asking a stupid question following up that, are there other things that you would suggest would be work towards bridging rather than being adversarial?
Well, I certainly do think where we have commonality, we should promote that. And one of the safe areas, I think, is at universities because my colleagues at other universities in China, I don't know, they're just like they think they're just they're not if you get them in a quiet moment, they're critical of their society just as faculty members here are critical of this society. So I think wherever we have possibilities of being commonality, we should do that. And there's certainly areas where we need to definitely work. I mean, climate change is one of them. Anything in medicine and pandemics. The fact that we had pulled out of our relationship with China under the Trump administration, we could have had early warnings of what was going on there. Instead, we were behind the curve a bit. So, all of that really does not help for what the world needs. Should we place more focus on Mandarin in schools? Well, I think I think for young people to learn Mandarin is a great thing. I mean, they're going to be big players. Look, this is not 1980. China is going to be an equal of ours, or at least a major player in the East. And for a young person to learn Mandarin, I think is very wise.
There is one more question in the chat as well. How would you describe the general opinion of Chinese citizens towards the US and the EU?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say, of course, the people that I speak to at universities are not the average citizen. So, especially the ones that I know have relationships with the US, and so it's very positive. But generally, if what you hear all of the time in the news is negative towards the US, the attitudes would be negative. There's no relationship that they have other than what they hear on their media. And so when they hear the US doing negative things towards China, they will have a negative, they would have negative view. So it's pretty understandable, but that's why I think the more relationships we have, the better.
If there are no other questions, and those were great questions, thank you. And thank you, Joe, for fielding those. Thank you all for attending tonight's event. Please join us next Tuesday evening for Laura Hendry's discussion of the relations between Europe and Russia. And also on February 15th, the following week, we'll have William Hall, and he will discuss Eastern Europe 30 years after the Soviet Union collapsed. And on the Portland Library's website, you can find the suggested reading list for this year's Camden Conference, which will be held only virtually on the weekend of the February 25th through the 27th. Again, Joe, thank you. He's at the Muskie Institute. I'm sure you can track him down. And thank you, V, for helping tonight, and she'll be with us for the following weeks. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.